Hola, and here we go on the Electric Human number 5. And this one is called the charge, or it could have been called the zap, or it could have been called the surge, because the focus this time is about how energy can come in a rush, in a charge, in a zap, and this element, how it happens, why it happens, when it's a good thing, when it's a bad thing. And there's just some very curious aspects to do with it, and very important aspects, because in some ways it takes into consideration certain cares, or certain cares need to be taken into consideration in this area, because we all know to take care with electrical sockets, right, and electricity, you've got to do something serious, you call the electrician. So we know that energy can be dangerous. We know that it can kill. And so we are also electrical beings, and it may not be that we get that degree of energy that can kill, like an electrical surge coming through a power line, an external power line on the street, for example, or a lightning bolt. But we do know that waves of energy in the form of emotion and upset can totally break up a relationship, can break up a friendship, because the energy flux has been destabilized. That's one element of it that we're going to talk about, but I want to start first of all talking about the fact that when we start feeling energy, at first it's quite subtle. And here I'm talking about the aura radiation that comes out of the hands, that comes out of the eyes. We've touched on this in previous sections. But there is an energy that comes out of the eyes. There's an energy that comes out of the nose. There's an energy that comes out of the chin, depicted in Egyptian artwork. There's energy that comes out of the hands and fingers. When people start to go into this area, they often expect something like a Harry Potter scenario, where there's going to be this huge zap, like a lightning bolt come out of the hands, or Thor's hammer, and fire and lightning is coming out of it. I recall once in a park with some students training in sensitivity to start feeling things. And what I did was I had my back against a tree, and I had my negative hand, which is my left hand, against the tree, to let the force and nature and frequency of the tree flow through my system. And then I projected out with my right hand. And actually, there's a photo that shows an odd shape exactly around the center of my hand. But what I also did was I pointed my hand at one of the students, at the hand of a student, and I traced up and down on her hand, pointing. And there was a line of force coming out from my hand. And she was a few meters away, actually, but I was feeling quite a lot of charge from this tree. I knew that it would reach her. And I asked her, do you feel anything? And she said, not really. And I said, nothing. And she said, well, there's like a line of energy going up and down my hand, which is exactly what I was doing. But we laughed about it, because actually she was a new student, and she was expecting something more impacting. She was expecting we called it the Harry Potter experience. She was expecting, I don't know, you see these movies, everything's zap and blast, and when a person taps into power, it's like huge amounts of power coming through. Kind of interesting, actually, that in the last couple of decades, this notion has kind of turned up, and they're expressing it a lot more in series and movies and things, this idea of humans firing out power. I say that's interesting because we'll touch on this at the end of this session. There is more power starting to come into the human system, but it's not going to be a very good idea to have that much power come through too soon, too quick. Otherwise, like electrical equipment, it can burn the circuits. So the point about the Harry Potter lesson is, if you're starting to develop sensitivity, be content with small successes. If you're registering something, be encouraged, because we've spent a lot of our life not sensing anything, not feeling anything. And if you start to develop sensitivity to energy, that's great. And you want to encourage yourself and start to compare different frequencies and natures and intensities, and get interested in a little bit in a detective or scientific type of way. So About the charge. So we obviously run on a certain charge. We have a certain frequency of energy. If you think about the aura, you think about the forces, the plasma forces in and around the planet. We exist in a kind of plasma, and we exist in a kind of certain degree of energy charge. The planet has a certain frequency, and that's great. We're used to that. We're accustomed to that degree of intensity and that nature. What happens sometimes is we go somewhere, there's a greater intensity, and we feel a charge. It could be a sacred place, but it could also be a place that's not particularly sacred. It's just that there's a lot of people, for example, like a protest or a football match. And there's thousands of people cheering with the same type of frequency, same sort of attitude, same sort of nature. And there you are. And what happens, of course, we know the feeling. You've probably experienced it at least once in your life. You get swept up. And what that really means, that swept up, that expression swept up, is that force is now flooding through you. I guess a better expression would be you get swept through or you get swept along with this greater charge. And sometimes that will change a person's life. They'll become a disciple of a certain religion or a disciple of a certain football team because they enjoy that charge coming through, because of course it's much greater than the personal charge, right? It's interesting, we have expressions, touched on this before, but we have expressions like, who's the guy in charge? Almost as if inside language we know from a historic trace that at one time the person in charge had some degree of more energy coming through because he had to handle more, he had to deal with more things, deal with more people. So at these times we register that there can be more energy come into our system. And of course, especially young people tend to enjoy, I know I did myself, young people tend to enjoy throwing themselves into situations where there is a charge of energy. And partly that's because we're like experimenting with our potential, with possibility. What can this equipment do? Just like you get something, some instrument, some piece of equipment, and you want to test when you're young the tolerances of this thing. I mean, children literally smash things because they're trying to test the limits of things. And we do it with ourselves. And in New Zealand, where I come from, we do it with radical sports. Bungee jumping, jumping out of airplanes, whitewater rafting, mountain climbing, all that type of stuff is to cause a kind of charge. And you get to that wahoo moment, you know, you're on the top of a mountain or you're bungee jumping and you scream. And that scream and shout of wow is the charge coming through to having realized that experience or in the middle of that experience. And that's all very well. Of course, we don't live in that high state of charge of jumping out of airplanes. Most of us end up back into a kind of more stable flux. That's actually where the conversation is a little bit more relevant and interesting because that's our day-by-day life. So let's look for a moment how this surge or charge can cause problems in a relationship. There's an idea that things don't just happen. There's always a build-up. My mother in Australia was telling me the other day that her area where she lives was blocked off because a guy had been driving in his car and the wife changed the radio station and he said not to change it and she changed it and he went berserk. He stopped the car and he's threatening her and then people tried to come and he's threatening them and the police came and the whole scenario. All apparently because of this little radio station thing. The point is, though, that was not about the radio station. That was the point when the charge exploded. It was the tipping point. There's a book called The Tipping Point that I recommend. There's a build-up and then there's a tipping point where there's an explosion. So part of the awareness of charge is knowing that it builds up. There's a build-up. It's the same with lightning. Lightning builds up and then there's a charge of lightning. And it's the same with people. When you see a person exploding, or if it happens to you yourself, you know, you suddenly find yourself exploding or overreacting to something, you can be sure there's been a build-up, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. It's been building slowly up, and then it comes out. There's a tipping point. There's the straw, as they say. They used to have this old expression: the straw that broke the camel's back or the donkey's back. In Portuguese, they say the last drop of water. It's like some balance, and just one more drop of water, and the balance changes. This certainly happens with energy. For some reason, the mechanism works that it all comes at once. And this can be very shocking, good word, shocking, for the other person, because they haven't seen this build-up occurring. It's often happening in our inner worlds, and then it suddenly explodes, and suddenly it's coming out, and it's shocking for the other person. They're not expecting this charge. And also, you'll notice that when it happens, it's coming out from a kind of a state in the person. It causes a state that very often the person loses control, or they can't control their reaction. And that's because it's been building up in the semi-conscious and unconscious vectors of the brain. So when it comes out, they don't really have conscious control of it. I remember reading a story many years ago when I was studying this subject more closely, and I was collecting examples. One of the examples was there was a court process going on in Italy of a man who had killed his mother. And what had happened was he simply stood up one day and strangled her. And when he was in court, he said, she gave me spaghetti shouldn't laugh, but, she gave me spaghetti every day for, I think he said 20 years or something. And I asked her for other things, but every time she ignored me and gave me more spaghetti. And he said, until one day something in me snapped, and I stood up and I did what I did. And that's how serious it can be, this sudden charge coming and taking over a person and destroying something. It has that potential to destroy. There is a positive potential, of course. There's a great possibility with charge, but just for the moment, we're looking at this particular aspect. I remember another story that impacted me too was a woman who was in New York looking for a parking space, and she had driven around the block several times. Some of us know that feeling, looking for a space. And she finally found a space. Again, I shouldn't laugh, but I think it's because we recognize the feeling so well, and it's so ridiculous, really, what happens, that it causes this laughter. Laughter in its own way is a type of explosion. It's interesting, normally caused by contradiction. But anyway, she pulled forward and she had a blinker on to back into the parking space, and somebody else came in and parked in the spot. And she simply got out of her glove box a gun, walked over to the car, tapped on the window. The guy wound down the window and she shot him. And there's a case of overspill. Now, you could say, well, it was about her going round and round and round looking for a park. But for sure, there was another trace of build-up of frustration, anger, upset, indignation in her life. In that particular instance was simply a moment of overspill. And again, coming out of the unconscious and semi-conscious, because she later would say things like, I don't know what came over me. I lost my head. There are these expressions. So the message there is to be aware of this feature, because it can happen to someone around you. It can happen to somebody on the street when you're around, and it can happen with yourself. So when you're dealing with people, unfortunately, you have to be aware that there are things that can trigger this. I think people are kind of semi-aware of this, and this is why more and more we treat carefully with each other, and people watch what they say because they don't want to trigger this sort of explosion. But particularly for oneself, to be aware of things that build up in the background and be honest about them. Try to ask yourself, how am I really feeling? Do I have feelings of anger, upset building up? do what you need to do to bring that charge down, which can include physical exercise, maybe therapy, maybe walking, maybe nature is good because nature has a negative polarity in that it absorbs energy when you go for a walk. The green, the trees, the flowers, the grass, all this helps us to balance out a positive charge, which the city tends to cause as well, tends to cause a positive polarity charge buildup. Now, the fascination in this area is, of course, we are attracted to having more charge come through us, to have flow come through us. Growth and evolution and spiritual development imply a greater charge coming through, don't they? Because throughout history, saints and saviors and holy people are shown with more energy, more light, which implies more charge coming through them. This says that there's some inner circuitry that can handle that charge. And one of the components of that circuitry, for sure, is an array of qualities: care, patience, service, compassion, love, honor, respect, patience. Did I say patience already? But there's quite a few qualities that a person needs that if a greater charge is coming through them electrically, they're going to handle that charge. It's easier said than done. You know, you can think you're very patient until you're in a situation that needs patience, and then you get tested, don't you? And so it's important to work on these qualities when you don't need them. It's like football players training before the game. In life, if you're intending to become more spiritually connected, it's important to work on the qualities day by day. Even though it may not seem that important in the day by day, your vision is that you're trying to train yourself to be a person who can handle more charge, handle more light, handle more energy. A lot of people, I think, mistakenly think that, oh, if I came into the presence, or if I come into a connection of high holy force, I will automatically be a safe person, automatically be a good person. I will automatically know how and what to do with this energy. This is not the case. This is not the case. It is actually a real force, and it needs to be handled carefully. And one needs to be able to direct this energy and hold this energy and have this array of qualities that can allow you to deal with others without, for example, coming on too strong, or suddenly being a bully, or this type of thing. It's a very fascinating line of consideration. The final point here in this particular episode of The Electric Human is that there is a charge coming into the planet and increasing the force of the planet. I've mentioned this before. And so in some ways, we're all having to face this reality. We're having to face this process of dealing with more charge. And again, if we don't rise with the tide, it can come through in a burst. This is what surges in an electrical circuit. You know, it happened here recently where I live. There's an elevator, and what happened was the power went out in the neighborhood. And when the power came back on, there was an electrical surge, and it blew the circuits of the elevator, and they had to replace a whole panel or something. So this is called a surge, and they have a stabilizer, don't they? Computers and electrical equipment sometimes have, or often have, stabilizers so that if the power goes out and then comes back on, there's been a build-up, and now it comes through and it can blow the computer. So the stabilizer assimilates and balances this power. This is my non-technical language, so that the computer doesn't get damaged. And in a way, we also need a stabilizer. And we need stabilizing activities, like deep breathing into the abdomen is a good stabilizer. Calling over certain ideas can be a good stabilizer. The ideas of staying calm, the ideas of it's going to be okay, the idea of not wanting to harm others, especially with words or emotions or attitudes. There are certain things we like fail safes we need to put into ourselves so that if there is a surge, we continue to be a safe person. And I think it's an increasing safety. I think it's something that needs to be rechecked and revisited, this safety feature. But what I'm saying is this is coming into the planet. So unless we decide to evolve and rise with the tide of energy that's starting to appear, it can come suddenly as a surge. And what you'll see around you, I think, more and more is things that are undealt with from the past: sadness, depression, anger, upset. These will be picked up with this energy as it's trying to flush through the system, and these things will come to the surface. And so it's a very testing time that we're going into. We do need to start looking at ourselves as electrical humans, thus the reason for this series. And I hope you find the discussion useful. If you do, please leave a comment in the chat. It's always encouraging to see. And check out the Ruby Mountain course. There's a lot more information and understandings from a variety of professors. We call them Ruby Mountain guides. Fascinating subjects, starting with a lot more about the electrical human and then going into other specific territories and trails. So that's on rubyendeavor.org/journey. You can check out that course. And that's it. Be careful with your energies. Be careful of the charge. And while we build up more power, let's try to get the right balances and right temperance to deal with that force. And I'll see you next time.